To probe scientific mysteries, I sometimes resort to storytelling. With just a bare-bones story, can I trigger my imagination into coming up with answers? Let me show you how. The mystery this time is embryology. What role do our genomes play in it? I have to start by setting up the story, setting up the situation. Then I can try to trigger my imagination within the setup. In this story, standing in for the developing embryo is the building of a palace. You, the reader, are the prince for whom the palace is being built. The part of the embryo's genome is played by a gnome. I appear as the author. The story starts out in a small cabin corresponding to the single-celled embryo. He'd never asked his parents anything about their palace, the prince realized, how they built it and how long that took. He just knew it involved a manual containing all the information they needed, and that a copy of this manual lay in a cupboard in his one-room cabin next to the photocopier. "Let's begin," said the prince, and he opened the cupboard. Inside was not one manual, but dozens of them. When he took one down and opened it, he could barely read the tiny type that covered each of its many pages, and the text consisted of nothing but strings of symbols. He brought out each of the volumes and thumbed through them, but he found no plan or any instructions for how to use them. What was he to do? At this point, there was a creaking sound in the ceiling, and a trapdoor appeared that the prince had never noticed before. Peering around the edge of the trapdoor came the face of a gnome. "Can I help you?" the gnome asked. The prince had never seen the gnome before. "Who are you?" he asked. "I built this room," said the gnome. "Every room in the old palace was built by gnomes like me. We live in these attics." The prince held the gnome down. "Then you know what these mean?" he asked, pointing to the pile of manuals. The gnome said he did. "Then you can show me and we'll get building," said the prince. But the gnome said no. Only gnomes know how to build from these plans. The plans were much too complicated for anyone other than gnomes to understand. "Using those manuals, you can build another palace just like your parents," he said, "with its many rooms, each one different and richly furnished. But you had to know where in the dozens of manuals to look for every little detail, and how to make every one of the hundreds of materials you'd need to make it. Why, it would take you more than a lifetime to learn how," he said. "You'll need gnomes for each room you build. They'll build the room for you, and they'll have little gnomes that'll build the next room, and so on. Each new gnome will know how to build the next room needed." He went back into the attic, and with half an hour returned with a little gnome just like himself. The new gnome went straight to work. He took each manual, used the room's photocopier to copy it from end to end, and rebound the sheets so he had a copy just like the original. Then he set to work building. In no time at all, he'd made another room adjoining the first, everything specified by the plan, even down to its own photocopier, and an attic where he took up residence. And shortly there was another gnome and another, and soon there were more gnomes, each with a copy of the manuals, all a building. They seemed to know just where in the manuals to look for whatever they needed. And soon the palace began to take shape. One day, while the prince was resting in his room, he got curious. He knocked on the trapdoor in his room and the ceiling and asked the gnome to come down. "I don't remember my parents ever mentioning that I'd need gnomes as well as my manuals," he said. "That's because they never really understood what we did," replied the gnome. "And I'm not sure I do either," said the prince. "Tell me, how did you learn where to go for everything you needed in those enormous manuals at every stage?" "Oh, I didn't learn it. Nobody could learn that much information. I was born knowing how. You could say I came with the manuals." But every room is different. How do you know what kind of room to build? Where's the plan of the palace that tells you what size and kind of room to build? There's no plan of the palace, said the gnome. We just know how by what's happening in the rooms around us. We make our room to fit in with whatever that is. But what about the plumbing system? Asked the prince. It runs straight throughout the entire building and just keeps growing bigger as the building grows. How do you know how to keep extending the part of it that runs through your room so it reaches the rooms further down beyond your neighbors? The gnome opened his mouth but seemed lost for words. And unlike you gnomes, I visit both rooms of the wings of the palace, and they're both identical, down to the very last item of furnishing and the sizes of every floorboard and window. How does a gnome working in one wing know what the gnome's doing who's working in the corresponding room in the other wing? All this information couldn't be in the manuals because all the manuals are the same in every room, while what's happening in each room is different. And although the manuals don't change, each room keeps changing to fit in with what's happening elsewhere in the palace. And the gnome, seeing the prince so concerned, came over and sat next to him. He placed one hand on the prince's knee. With the other, he took off his cap. Look inside my cap, he said gently. Here comes a trigger for the imagination. Inside the gnome's cap, the prince saw a staircase winding down. He was astonished. He didn't realize the gnome had cast a spell on him so he'd be small enough to look inside. Treading down the staircase, he found himself inside an enormous cavern filled with the most extraordinary and wonderful machinery such as he'd never seen before. The whole place hummed with the sound of 1,000 engines that powered the machinery. So the whole cavern seemed to be alive, shimmering and vibrating. He wandered for what seemed like hours, never seeing the same piece of machinery twice or even recognizing what most of them were for. The cavern inside the gnome was much, much bigger than the old palace had been. It seemed to go on forever. Suddenly the prince found himself back in his room, sitting next to the gnome, who was removing his hand from the prince's knee. That's how we use the manuals to build the palace, said the gnome. But what's inside you is much more complicated than even the manuals themselves, said the prince. The gnome nodded. Then I've got one last question, said the prince. I understand that a photocopier to copy the manuals is built into the plan for every room and gets built as part of the room itself. That doesn't seem so surprising, and I can assume the first gnome arrived with the first copy of the manuals, right? The gnome nodded. But how do you, reproduce? Where does the gnome for each new room come from, and how does he know which room in the palace he's building? If I knew that, I think I'd understand this palace much better. At this point, the gnome turned away from the prince and faced over in my direction. This isn't going to work, he said. I looked around to see who he was talking to. I'd never had one of my characters talk to me directly before, but there was no one but me. What did you say? I asked. I said, this isn't going to work, he repeated, and then he just stared at me. The insolence of it took my breath away. Don't just sit there, make it work, I said. The gnome got up and walked to the door. He turned. If you've nothing else for me to do, I'll be going. He paused briefly, then opened the door, stepped through, and closed it behind him. As you can see, I couldn't make the story work. In my tour of the genome's dungeon, I hadn't been able to conceive of the magic needed for building such a palace. I'd written myself into a dead end. But I still had my gnome, I decided to try again. When I'd recovered my wits, I vowed to get even with my gnome. Sure enough, a few weeks later, I saw in my morning paper a story about a new financier who was taking Wall Street by storm. With a photo. It was my nefarious gnome. I noted the address and planned a surprise visit. It was lunchtime. I'd positioned myself next to the entrance of the building. Sure enough, in a few moments, my gnome, dressed in an expensive and I must admit very flattering suit, came out with two companions. As they walked past me, I called out, "Gnome? Gnome?" He stopped, turned, and faced me. "Yes," he said calmly. I said things I shouldn't have said, I know that. After a moment he turned back, muttered a word or two to his companions, and they continued walking. "I'll never use you in a story again," I called after him. Fuming, I returned home. But I don't know. A gnome that can manage a cell in your body and go on to run a multinational corporation, that's a character it's hard to discard. I wasn't surprised a few weeks later when the phone rang. It was my gnome. "Things haven't quite worked out for me on Wall Street," he said. "Can I return? Can you find something for me to do?" He walked in quite calmly and took a seat. "You've got to fix it," I said. "There've been no construction since you left. Get to work. Do whatever you have to do." Here's where gnomes are useful in stories, particularly gnomes with experience in the financial district. They're extra smart. You just tell them to do something, and they use magic to get it done. "Well, don't just sit there," I said. "Get on with it." "It's already begun," he muttered. "Everything's working okay." And it was, just like that. It all had to do with some wireless phone doodad he'd brought with him from his job in finance. He'd given one to all the other gnomes so they could work together, all communicating and collaborating from one end of the building to the other. Once they got going, the palace was built in no time. The two wings were near as damn it identical. And even as they grew, the plumbing system continued to grow with them all the time, working like a charm. So here was my answer. Embryology involves all our genomes communicating with one another telepathically throughout the length and breadth of our developing bodies, all keeping to the same plan and schedule. Impossible, of course, but then so are all the other accounts I've come across for how embryology works. Successions of chemical gradients, each one the basis for the next. Who dreamed that up?